In 1988, George Bush, the vice president under Ronald Reagan, was elected president. Now, as he was running for president, as we discussed previously, he talked about the idea of a new world order. The Cold War was coming to a close. The writing was on the wall as we started to see across Eastern Europe nations getting out from under the control of communist governments. And so we know there's going to be change. And the change comes very rapidly after George Bush takes office. First of all, we see in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapses as East Germany and West Germany open the doors and eventually reunite. We also surprisingly see over in China, the Chinese government for years had been opening up economically to trade with the rest of the world. And they had been relaxing some of the controls within their own country. And young people were hoping for more rights and more freedom in this atmosphere. And the world was surprised as we watched in Tiananmen Square as Chinese students started to march and demand more democracy, more rights, more freedom. But the government of China wasn't ready to go that far. And so what we end up seeing, the world really thinks that there really might be on the verge of revolution in China and seeing an end to the communist control. But instead, the communist government cracked down hard, stopped the protesters, and maintained control. However, even though the communist government maintained control of China, they continued to open up more and more economically and trade with the rest of the world. So China had ceased to be any kind of a real communist economy. And although their communist government continued to maintain authoritarian control over their people, they definitely were not a true communist nation in that economic sense anymore. Meanwhile, over in the Soviet Union, we had seen Mikhail Gorbachev start to open up more opportunities for the Russian people in trade with perestroika, and under glasnost, more chances to speak their minds and more freedom of information. And as a result of that, and a result of starting to see the Eastern European nations gain their independence, the Communist Party became very concerned with Gorbachev's version of communism. And so what we end up seeing is an attempted coup to take over the government. But in reaction to that, Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected as the president of Russia, think in terms of like the governor of California. Russia is the biggest state in the Soviet Union, so he leads that state within the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev's under siege. He's being attacked by this coup, and Yeltsin, the president of Russia, leads the resistance against this coup. The coup fails, but within weeks of the end of this coup, the Soviet Union unravels, and former Soviet republics begin asserting their independence, including Russia itself, once again returning to being Russia. And so the Soviet Union dissolves. The Communist Party no longer controls the Soviet Union. In fact, many of the former states gain their independence. Others will stay tied to Russia. But the Cold War comes to a close. And as we enter this new phase, the world is no longer divided between what we like to call the free world and the communist world. Because the communist world, well, it's not there. And the United States really remains the one superpower left. And so as we enter this new phase, we're going to see different challenges. It didn't take long before those challenges became apparent. In Iraq, going to this map here, over here we see the Middle East. You have Iraq. Right next door you have Iran. To the north of all of that you have Russia and Europe. You have Saudi Arabia to the south. Iraq had built up a very large army. In fact, they had played the Cold War well, gaining supplies from both the free world and from the Russians. And Saddam Hussein had actually built up what was considered the fourth biggest army in the world. Only China, the United States, and Russia had bigger armies. And he decided that he would invade this tiny little country just to the south called Kuwait, which they asserted rightfully belonged to them. So Saddam Hussein's armies roll across the border. They easily take over Kuwait, which was rich with oil, and also a great port on the Persian Gulf. So there's a lot of reason to want to take over Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein was really gambling that the United States and other countries just wouldn't care. We'd just let him take it. What was surprising is the United States stood up to him and didn't do it unilaterally. We did this with a coalition. This is what the big difference is between what George Bush and later his son George W. Bush do when they go into the Middle East. George Bush, first of all, condemns what Saddam Hussein has done, invading another country. The United Nations moves to condemn that, and we start building a coalition of nations to condemn what he has done. And that even included the Russians and the Chinese. Both of them will openly, as part of the UN, condemn this invasion of Kuwait. The Russians will kind of play the role of trying to be mediator and make peace. They won't take part in the war, but they won't oppose us. And China is not going to oppose us either. So the United States gains support, and we build an alliance with other countries, including the other Arab countries. The other Arab countries, we may have had some bad blood with some of them because of our support of Israel, but Saddam Hussein's army taking over another Arab state was making the others nervous, that he's trying to become the superpower in the region. And they were afraid of him. They wanted help. And so the United States gains alliance with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states. We pointedly do not allow Israel to join our coalition because the other Arab states might not want to partner with Israel. So they stay along the sidelines. But we build a coalition, we start massing an army in Saudi Arabia, and we tell him, come February, we give him a date, if you're not out by this date, we're going to drive you out. But Saddam gambled that we really wouldn't do it. After all, we hadn't really gone into a real war since Vietnam. And to be quite honest, most of the American people had that in the back of our minds, that we don't want another Vietnam. We don't want to get bogged down in some long, protracted war. So a lot of Americans were very nervous about this. And a lot of Americans weren't sure that we would do anything more than talk. But Bush said he's got to get out. And when the date came and Saddam Hussein had not withdrawn his troops, the coalition led by the United States moved into action. And it was devastating. We quickly, within just a few days' time, swept the fourth largest army in the world out of Kuwait, out of southern Iraq. They lost somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people, destroyed their tank divisions, destroyed their military. And by comparison, the number of losses for the coalition were roughly about 300 and a handful of vehicles. It was a crushing defeat for Saddam Hussein. A major victory for Bush, and Bush's popularity rating soared. His popularity ratings were some of the highest a president had ever seen in American history. People were proud. We had won this war. We had stood up to aggression, and we were really kind of starting to take on this role in the New World Order as kind of a world policeman. We're starting to intervene when trouble appears around the world, and we're going to be the force of stability, at least if it's in our interest. However, we did not go into Iraq and take out Saddam's government. Now, within Iraq, there were Shia Muslims, and there were Kurds, and there were other ethnic groups that Saddam Hussein and the people that were in power had oppressed, and these people rebelled against him. And we really thought there was a good chance they might take down his government. But we had had the goal of liberating Kuwait, and Bush didn't move into Iraq to try to take over Saddam's government. And unfortunately, the rebellions crumbled, Saddam was able to hold on to power, and he will stay around for another decade to annoy us, to defy us. Part of the agreement when the war ended is that he had to allow us to inspect his country for weapons of mass destruction because he had stockpiled before the war chemical weapons and other devastating weapons which he was not supposed to have. And throughout the next 10 years, he would occasionally allow international inspectors to make inspections, but often he would delay those inspections and deny those inspections. And eventually, this is going to lead to a second intervention in Iraq a decade later. But for the moment, Saddam had been defeated, Kuwait had been protected, the United States was a champion of freedom around the world. Bush was popular. But if you remember, Bush had promised, read my lips, no new taxes. Well, we just fought a war, and the economy had shifted. And it was really kind of necessary at this point to raise taxes to keep things stable. And so, and historians are kind of starting to look at this now as a positive thing to say about Bush, that Bush made the decision, knowing it would hurt him politically, to do what was best for the American economy and the American government and to raise taxes. But it was damning because he had broken that promise. And the problem was the Gulf War ended a full year before the presidential election when he would run for a re-election. And people forgot. And the economy started to turn. And the taxes went up. And people suddenly changed their minds about Bush. And his popularity rating, which had been so high, started to plummet. Now, in the election of 1992, there's another shift going on as well. We had seen the moral majority, this conservative moral voter group, help push Reagan into power. And part of that was a turn back towards traditional moral feelings in America. And when we saw Bush get elected the first time, the front runner, Gary Hart, had to drop out of the race because he had been caught messing around. And that didn't look good. But by 1992, people are less concerned about the morals than they are about the economy. The phrase becomes, it's the economy, stupid. That's the thing to focus on. And so one of the factors in this race is going to be a Texas billionaire, H. Ross Perot. Now, Perot, he starts a new political party, the Reform Party. He says the Republicans and the Democrats, they both fail to make promises, they're both bad at business, and we need somebody who can fix the economy like a businessman. And so Perot enters the race. Now, the Democrat who's running is William Jefferson Clinton of Arkansas. Bill Clinton was somewhat young and had a really good connection with people in the way he communicated. Really, Clinton kind of sets the standard that from the Clinton era on, other politicians are all going to copy his playbook and the way they present issues and the way they talk about the issues. If you've ever seen during a campaign, they talk about how, let's say, taxes are hurting the American people. They don't say, well, it's hurting the American people. They say, James Johnson of Wilmington, Idaho, has a farm, and the economy is hurting him. And they use that individual as the example, and they make it very personal. Clinton kind of pioneered that way of communicating that politicians have all followed since then because it was very highly effective. And he played to the young people, playing his saxophone, appearing on MTV. He knew how to connect with people. But then he stepped into the middle of scandal. For the first time, he is going to be caught with an affair. He had apparently had an affair while he was governor of Arkansas with, and I'm going to try to keep all these women straight because there'll be more. I believe the first woman was Jennifer Flowers. That came out during the campaign. Now, that would have destroyed him 4 years before. But we're a few years past, and at this point, the economy is the bigger issue, and the most important thing is his wife, Hillary Clinton, stands by him. Openly, she is forgiving about the affair, and she stands by him and says, vote for my husband. And the truth be told, she kind of had some political aspirations of her own. And this relationship with Bill Clinton is going to give her that opportunity later on. So this is a strong political partnership between them. Whether or not the marriage itself is good, the political partnership is great. And she stands by him. And in this election, it ends up being fairly close. And the deciding factor is Perot. You see, some people were going to vote Democrat and some were going to vote Republican, but when Perot enters the race, because he was a businessman, he tended to pull more voters from the Republican Party that were business-minded than he did from the Democrats. And so you could very much make the argument that he turns the tide of the election, he takes more votes from Bush, and Clinton becomes the president. So after 12 years of Republican rule, now we're going to see a Democratic president. But the thing to remember is during the Reagan administration, Democrats controlled the Congress for about 6 of those years. And under Clinton, he is going to become a Democratic president, but by the time the first midterm election rolls around, the Republicans will gain control of Congress. So we're going to have to see, just like in the Reagan era, some cooperation between political parties to get things done. And that's really a kind of a positive about what goes on in the 80s and in the 90s. Yes, there's political division, and yes, there's going to be some ugly moments, but you do see Republicans and Democrats finding ways throughout both decades to work together and accomplish things. And in the Clinton era, there will be successes, but the successes Clinton has will mostly have to come through cooperating and compromising with the Republicans controlling the Congress. So, some of the things that are landmark events during Clinton's administration. One is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it's symbolized by an American, Mexican, and Canadian flag. Now, in Europe, we had what was called the European Union, where they had created a free trade zone where you could trade across borders without taxes and without stringent government regulations. It was an area where you could trade freely. So here in America, during the Clinton administration, NAFTA is formed. And from Canada through the United States into Mexico, we ease restrictions along the borders, and we lift taxes and tariffs along the border, and we allow more open trade. Now, both Republicans and Democrats praised it and thought it was a great thing, and both Republicans and Democrats had their reasons for why they criticized it. And NAFTA, really throughout its history, it's not so much a partisan issue, because there's people on both sides that like it and people on both sides that dislike it. And eventually we're going to see when Donald Trump finally becomes president, he's going to say NAFTA's a mess and we've got to fix NAFTA because it's just cheating the United States. And ultimately, Trump, during his administration, he will renegotiate and come up with a new plan to replace NAFTA. But really, if you look at the plan, it's mostly just NAFTA with a few tweaks that did improve things a little for the U.S., but it still basically was the NAFTA plan. So this trade agreement is going to benefit in many ways businesses throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico, but there will be some controversy of it taking jobs outside of the country, creating problems, and it's still somewhat controversial today, but for the most part, it's looked at as a success that Clinton gets this done. Now, another huge thing that's going to happen is trying to balance the budget. We had been spending a lot. Our government had been getting bigger and bigger throughout the 60s and 70s, and Reagan had wanted to downsize the government, but he had spent like crazy on the military, and we've got to get the budget under control. And one of the biggest things that Clinton has in his favor is he is going to balance the federal budget. It's going to take working with Republicans because they want to make cuts some places and Democrats want to make them other places. One of the things that's going to have to be agreed on is government welfare programs. Democrats want to save those programs. Republicans want to cut them. they end up with a compromise that the programs will stay in place, but per the Republicans' desire, they're going to shift a lot of these programs to where the states get to administer them and get to put some regulations in and maybe tighten up spending a little bit. So they find a compromise. And they shorten the time that people can draw welfare. So they start to make compromises, even though there's challenges, and ultimately they balance the budget. And when the Clinton years end, we won't be talking about balancing the budget. We'll be talking about, in the 2000 election, what to do with all the extra money, because we're actually by then bringing in more money than we're spending. Now, that was a very temporary thing, and it didn't mean there wasn't a national debt, but it did mean the budget was balanced during the 1990s. And the economy throughout most of the 90s had fixed itself, and it was going well. And this is why Clinton will get elected to a second term of office, and why, even with scandal, Clinton remained fairly popular, because the economy was good. Now, Clinton is going to get us involved in some foreign affairs. There's going to be, over in Africa, in Somalia, a civil war going on, and the United States, as part of a UN force, will be over there trying to bring peace and order, and that will create some problems. If you've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, we lost some lives. We got in the middle of a fight over there. Over in Kosovo, in what had once been the former communist country of Yugoslavia, the Serbs were cracking down on other ethnic groups, and the NATO, led by the United States, is going to come in and stop what many considered a genocide. And it'll mostly be done with an air war rather than having to send a lot of troops onto the ground to fight, but we're going to intervene there. And we end up, because Saddam Hussein is defying us, making a couple of bombing attacks on Iraq to get him back in line. So Clinton will commit troops to overseas action. However, it's the domestic affairs which are most memorable about Clinton's administration. Now, the first thing is Republicans end up controlling Congress. And because they control Congress, and because there are some real questions about Clinton, I mean, he left himself open to this with the way he behaved, they start investigating. But the first thing that they created an investigation for wasn't about his extramarital affairs. It was about his business affairs. He and Hillary Clinton had been involved in a real estate deal in Arkansas called Whitewater. And there were questions about whether it was being run properly and about whether there was improper use of money or taxes or other issues. So the Republicans, for political purposes, created a committee to go start digging for dirt. Well, they dug for dirt, and they never found enough dirt to pin anything on the Clintons. Problem is, you go digging around in the Clintons' garden much, you're going to find something. And what you found with Bill Clinton was another extramarital affair. Paula Jones had been his secretary while he was the governor of Arkansas. And on a business trip, he had had her up to his room with state patrolmen around the room guarding it. And they had had relations. And she comes out and says, you know what? This was really statutory rape. He pressured me into having relations with him. Now, he claimed, no, I didn't pressure at all. It was consensual. But she says, hey, the police were outside. I didn't feel like I had a choice. I was pressured into it. And the Republicans are actually considering bringing up the President of the United States on rape charges while he's the sitting president. But then they found more dirt. And the thing that's eventually going to get him is his White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. He and Monica Lewinsky were having an affair. They were messing around. And as they investigated, one of her friends ratted her out, told information to the Republican committee led by a fellow by the name of Kenneth Starr. And they found out that she not only was having a relationship with the president, but that there was a dress that she had sent to the dry cleaner that might just have DNA evidence of such an affair. So they seized the dress, And then they asked the president under oath questions. And they asked him, was he having a relationship with Monica Lewinsky? And he not only told them, he told the American people in an address to the American people, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And that's kind of sad. You got great quotes from presidents throughout history. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Or the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The memorable line for Clinton is, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. It's a low point morally for the American presidency, it seems like. And still, there's that strong voting group of moral voters that can be swayed by dragging this out there. And that's what this is kind of about. He wasn't putting the country at great risk because he was having an affair. It is morally reprehensible, but this is politically valuable. So they said, hey, Mr. President, here's the blue dress. You say you didn't have sexual relations? Well, here's your DNA on this dress to prove it. And so the president is caught lying under oath. And he is impeached because all it takes to impeach is a majority, a simple majority in the House of Representatives. And the Republicans had a simple majority. So they voted to impeach President Clinton. Now, after he's impeached, to throw him out, they'll have to have a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and they aren't close. The Republicans, a lot of them would have to vote with them, and they're not going to. So why do they even bother? Because it becomes political theater. The whole country watches as the Clintons' dirt is drug out in front of the nation, and they hammer home the point that he's an immoral man. Even though they bring all this evidence and assassinate his moral character, Clinton is, of course, found. He's not kicked out. They vote to dismiss the charges. He will serve out the rest of his term. And it was in his second term by the time this all unfolds. So Clinton serves out his 2 terms, and his popularity remained high even after this scandal. But in the 2000 election, there just may have been a payoff. In 2000, it's an extremely close election.